The deck beneath Megan's boots carried the deep vibration of a wounded ship, a steady reminder that damage below was already compromising the carrier's balance. The red glow of emergency lights cut through the smoke in thin, trembling beams, turning the swirling haze into a shifting curtain. Sirens wailed overhead, their pitch bending in and out against the groan of metal strained by heat. Somewhere to starboard, an explosion rolled through the hull, a low, concussive thud that sent a ripple through the deck plates and into her legs. She kept her breathing steady, eyes locked forward, as the Marines on either side of her moved in a low line toward the dark shape of the island superstructure. The air was thick enough to sting the back of her throat. Smoke curled around the deck lights, warping them into glowing spheres that floated in the haze. The sprinklers hammered water down in uneven bursts, some jets arcing into the smoke and others splashing directly against the deck. Ahead, the hulking shape of a tied-down fighter jet shimmered in the heat. Flames licked along its fuselage, and the heavy odor of burning fuel rolled toward them. Megan shifted her footing, careful to skirt the worst of the pooling fuel that gleamed under the lights. Every step forward felt like crossing a field of invisible tripwires. The Marines adjusted their pace, weaving between the shapes of damaged aircraft. A support crewman, his helmet missing and his coveralls blackened, stumbled from the haze ahead, moving without seeing them until a corporal caught him and shoved him toward the rear. Megan barely slowed, her focus pinned on the way the red-lit smoke churned against the base of the island tower. The carrier listed slightly to port, forcing her to lean against the tilt to stay balanced. The tie-down cables strung across the deck shifted in her periphery, both an anchor point and a snag hazard if the squad lost awareness in the smoke. The first blast came from somewhere off their right, a sudden fireball from another aircraft's ruptured tank. The concussion knocked her shoulder into the Marine beside her, both of them dropping low as shards of debris clattered across the deck. A rolling wave of heat pushed past, carrying with it the acrid bite of scorched paint and molten plastic. Megan pressed her gloved hand against the deck, feeling it hot beneath the constant spray from the sprinklers above. They had seconds before the fire's reach shifted again. They regrouped fast. Voices came sharp over headsets, muffled under the roar of the suppression systems. Megan listened for her call sign through the static and bursts of background noise. Orders cut through in short, precise bursts, confirming their path forward and reaffirming the priority. The island had to be reached, no matter what the deck threw at them. It was the ship's brain for flight operations, and without it the carrier was blind in the middle of a fight. She acknowledged, her voice low and clear, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the cacophony around her. They resumed the push. Smoke rolled across the deck in long, horizontal waves, alternately revealing and hiding the way ahead. Emergency strobes flickered against the haze, creating disorienting shadows that jumped between wrecked planes. The Marines shifted formation to skirt another burning aircraft, its cockpit glass sagging inward from the heat. Megan's boots slipped slightly on the wet surface as she stepped over a loose tie-down chain, her eyes flicking toward the dark silhouette of the tower's base, just visible through the fog of smoke. Another concussive thud rolled up from below deck, rattling the steel underfoot. A thin spray of water arced unexpectedly from a ruptured line above, drenching her left side. The sudden cold cut through the oppressive heat for only a heartbeat before the steam surged back in. She blinked hard against the sting in her eyes, adjusting her grip on her rifle as the squad closed the distance toward the narrow approach to the tower. The last stretch to the island loomed ahead, a corridor of wreckage where flame and smoke fought the spray of seawater from the carrier's firefighting teams. Megan's gaze caught the faint movement of the tie-down cables swaying in the breeze, their rhythm steady, despite the chaos. They were a reminder of the ship's own heartbeat, the mechanical pulse still holding everything together under the strain. Her breath stayed measured, each exhale a deliberate act against the burning in her lungs. She knew the deck was more dangerous now than it had been minutes earlier, Fires shifted quickly. Smoke patterns changed with every gust of wind across the open deck, and explosions could happen without warning. But she also knew the order of movement mattered more than the hazards. The Marines around her moved in sync, every step a product of practiced discipline. The path forward was never perfectly clear, but they carried the shape of it in their heads, each one committed to closing the gap between their position and the island. Megan kept her eyes forward as the headset crackled again. The voice on the other end was clipped and certain, giving the same command they had started with: keep moving, reach the tower, hold it for flight operations. The carrier's fate in this battle depended on it. She gave a short, clear acknowledgement and adjusted her pace to match the lead. The smoke ahead swirled like a living thing, curling around the deck lights as if testing their endurance. With every step, she felt the mission anchor deeper inside her chest. Even with the fire consuming the deck, order held, carried forward by discipline and precision. The smoke deepened into a dense, unbroken sheet that swallowed the last steady flickers of firelight. The deck lights ahead turned into blurred halos, each one surrounded by its own ghostly corona. Megan slowed her breathing to keep from coughing, her movements measured against the growing blindness. The sound of the sirens faded beneath the low roar of the fire suppression systems, leaving only the occasional metallic groan of the ship's structure in her ears. Every step forward felt heavier, the air pressing against her face as if she were wading into a storm made of heat and ash. She lifted her optics, but the image they returned was warped and wavering. Heat shimmer rolled across the lenses, bending shapes until even the outline of a nearby aircraft looked like a living, shifting thing. A flicker of motion caught in the corner of her sight. But when she adjusted her aim, it was gone, folded back into the smoke. There was no telling if it had been a shadow, a reflection, or a human form. Her hands tightened on her weapon, the weight grounding her in the uncertainty. The Marines spread wider, spacing themselves by instinct, their formation no longer guided by sight but by the feel of the deck beneath their boots. Tie-down cables snaked across their path, their cold, wet metal rough under gloved hands. Megan gripped one as she passed. The tension in the steel line a quiet assurance that the deck's structure still held. Somewhere ahead, the outline of the island was hidden entirely, replaced by the vague glow of light filtering through layers of smoke. Gunfire rattled from somewhere within the haze, muffled by distance and the weight of the air. The muzzle flashes came and went in brief bursts, bright as lightning in a midnight storm, with no warning before they were gone again. Each one forced Megan to pause, recalculating the angles and thinking about where the next might come from. The silence in between was worse, making every unseen corner feel like it was holding its breath. They advanced carefully, eyes flicking downward as much as ahead. Spent shell casings littered the deck, their brass catching brief flashes of firelight like tiny beacons in the dark. They marked where fighting had already passed, but they also served as a warning. This was where someone had already been pinned down. Megan stepped around an abandoned helmet, its visor cracked and blackened, the inside dark with soot. It sat at an angle that suggested it had been left in a hurry, or dropped without choice. The ship's list made the footing uneven, forcing each step to adjust against the tilt. Megan relied on memory as much as sight, marking where catwalks and cables should be. A sudden gust from the port side shifted the smoke, thinning it for a heartbeat before it closed in again. For that instant, she caught sight of the faint, elevated glow of the island's windows, blurred but steady. It was the first solid reference point they had seen in several minutes. Her headset crackled, the voice on the other end low but certain, confirming their forward movement. The enemy was somewhere ahead, using the same cover of smoke to mask their approach. Megan's mind mapped the possible routes, running through where the enemy might set up to block them, and where they might be vulnerable. It was a calculation she had run before in other environments, but here every assumption came with the risk of being wrong in the next 5 seconds. The Marines moved low, hands brushing the tie-down cables as if they were the only guide through a collapsed maze. The cables hummed faintly with vibration, carrying the distant thrum of the ship's engines still laboring below. Megan kept her eyes forward, trusting the movement at her sides without needing to see it. Every step was deliberate, the sound of boots on steel muffled by the water and foam pooling on the deck. A sprinkler jet burst from a damaged pipe just ahead, shooting a column of water across their path. The spray cut the smoke for a moment, revealing not only the deck, but the looming outline of the island more clearly than before. Light from the windows glinted faintly on the wet steel, a muted signal in the chaos. Megan used it as an anchor in her vision, fixing it as the point they had to reach. The moment passed, and the haze folded back in, swallowing the island once more. But the image stayed in her mind, sharper than the distorted shapes around it. She didn't need to see it again to keep moving toward it. The battlefield was theirs only because they kept advancing when sight was stripped away, relying on the map in their heads and the discipline in their movements. Each step closed the distance, and each step reinforced the simple truth that momentum belonged to the ones who refused to stop. The blast came without warning, a sudden eruption from the burning FA-18 ahead that tore the air apart. Megan felt the concussion hit her chest before her mind caught up to what had happened. She dropped low instinctively, the heat slamming against her face as the shockwave rolled through the deck. Fragments of metal skittered past, hissing where they struck wet steel. The smell of vaporized fuel burned into the air, mixing with the acrid tang of scorched paint. For a moment, all she could hear was the hollow ringing inside her head. She pushed herself up, boots slipping on the slick surface. The fire suppression foam had already started to spread, a thick, pale layer rolling across the deck in uneven waves. Seawater spray from hoses joined it, drenching everything in a cold sheet that fought the heat, but made footing treacherous. The sprinklers above kept hammering, each burst distorting the smoke into twisting shapes that shifted with every gust. Beneath it all, Megan could feel the pulse of heat still radiating through the deck like a slow, pounding heartbeat. Over her headset, voices cut in through bursts of static. Positions were called, each one precise and clipped, confirming where every Marine was on the deck. The formation had scattered under the force of the blast, but they were already tightening back into shape. Megan scanned ahead through the churn of smoke and water, searching for the next obstacle. She found it in the glint of metal above, the faint flash of a weapons barrel catching the light. A machine gun team was dug in on a catwalk overlooking the approach to the island. Their fire cut long, erratic lines through the smoke, sparking against the deck and throwing up small bursts of foam. Megan knew the direct route was closed. Any attempt to cross under that line of fire would leave them pinned and exposed. The only choice was to go around, fast enough that the gun team couldn't shift their aim in time. She signaled the plan with a quick gesture, moving toward the shadowed bulk of a smoldering aircraft fuselage off their left. The wreckage still gave off heat, its metal skin warped and peeling where flames had eaten at it. Smoke rose from the open engine housing, curling upward in loose spirals before breaking apart in the rotor wash from a damaged helicopter nearby. The wash tore gaps in the haze, offering momentary glimpses of the catwalk above before folding them back into darkness. Megan led the way, keeping low and close to the fuselage. The wet deck reflected the pulsing red of the emergency lights, turning every step into a shimmer of color and shadow. Her boots slid once on a layer of foam, but she caught herself on a tie-down cable and kept moving. Behind her, the Marines advanced in a staggered line, each one using the wreckage as cover until they could slip past the machine gun's blind spot. The hiss of the foam underfoot and the thrum of rotor blades overhead blended into a steady, oppressive backdrop. As they rounded the rear of the fuselage, the heat from the burning aircraft ahead hit them again, forcing a quick change of pace. Megan adjusted their angle toward a narrow lane between two more wrecks. The smoke here thinner thanks to the constant churn of air from the helicopter's failing blades. In one of the brief clearings, she caught sight of the catwalk team turning their focus toward the starboard side, distracted by movement that wasn't hers. It was the gap they needed. She gave the push signal, and the squad surged forward, boots slapping against wet steel. The tie-down cables swayed faintly beside them, marking the straight run toward the base of the island. The glow of its windows grew clearer through the shifting haze, each flicker of light a reminder of why they were here. The machine gun fire stayed angled away, their flanking maneuver keeping them invisible to the high ground. By the time they reached the cover of the island's base, the sound of the catwalk gun was fading behind them. Megan let the squad regroup, her eyes on the laddered shapes of the stairwells leading upward. The route had cost them time, but they had kept their momentum. The battlefield never stayed still, and neither could they. In the churn of smoke and foam, the fragile thread of forward motion was still theirs to hold. The base of the stairwell loomed out of the haze like the throat of some dark, overheated tunnel. Megan could feel the heat radiating from the bulkheads before she even stepped inside, the metal almost vibrating with it. The air was thick and metallic, the tang of scorched steel layered with the faint bitterness of burning insulation. Overhead, a single sprinkler head dripped in slow, uneven beats, the droplets hissing where they struck the warm deck. She signaled the squad forward, stepping into the narrow space where the red glow from outside faded to the dim flicker of emergency lights. The gunfire from above echoed in sharp bursts, each shot bouncing off the walls until it sounded closer than it was. The stairwell amplified every noise, the scrape of boots, the clink of gear, the sharp breaths of Marines moving in the heat. Megan gripped the railing with her left hand, feeling the slick mixture of seawater and grease coat her glove. They moved one deck at a time, each ascent marked by a pause in the cooler shadows where intact bulkheads blocked the heat. The pauses were short, just enough to slow their breathing and listen for movement above. Smoke drifted down from higher levels, thin enough to see through, but enough to blur the shapes of the landings above. Megan kept her eyes locked on the turns ahead, her mind narrowing to the next step, the next angle, the next target point. Halfway up the second flight, the stairwell pulsed with a sudden white flash. The shock of the flashbang lit every surface and burned across her vision, followed by a concussive pop that seemed to shove the air out of the stairwell. For an instant, sound dropped away, replaced by a high ringing that blotted out the shouts around her. She blinked hard, forcing her focus to return, moving forward before the enemy could take advantage of the disorientation. The Marines tightened their formation, moving close enough that their shoulders brushed. Megan took point without hesitation, trusting her training to fill in what her vision couldn't. She counted the steps by feel, her boot soles dragging slightly on the metal treads. The railing remained her guide, both support and hazard, its wet surface forcing her to keep her grip steady without letting it pull her off balance. The enemy's fire came in short bursts now, aimed more to delay than to damage. Megan could hear the retreat in it, the calculated give of ground to buy time. She caught the faint slam of a door above, heavy, reinforced, followed by the muted clatter of a locking bar being dropped into place. They were consolidating in the tower itself, and every second the Marines spent on these stairs gave the defenders more time to fortify. The climb pressed on, each deck more oppressive than the last. The heat was a constant weight on her back, soaking into the plate carrier and holding there. Sweat stung her eyes, forcing her to blink without slowing. The stairwell's walls closed in with every turn upward, the sense of space shrinking until it felt like they were climbing inside the ship's own heartbeat. Every sound became sharper, the drip of water from the sprinkler above, the slide of boots against damp metal, the soft thud of a Marine's palm slapping the wall for balance. At the final landing before the tower level, Megan paused just long enough to catch the rhythm of her breath. Her pulse had settled into the same measured pace as the drips above, each one marking the seconds left before the next move. She studied the door at the top, its hinges blackened from heat, but still intact. Beyond it lay the control room, and beyond that, the reason they had been moving through smoke and fire since the first alarm. She glanced back at the squad, reading their readiness in the set of their shoulders and the grip on their weapons. Then she turned forward again, letting the heat and smoke fade from her mind. All that mattered was the space between her and that door. The short distance measured in steps and seconds, not yards. Victory here was not about speed, but about the precision of each move forward. The stairwell had taught her that. One careful step at a time until there were no more steps left to take. The breach came with a sharp kick that sent the heavy door swinging inward. Heat and smoke rushed out in a single wave, washing over Megan's face as she stepped through. The interior of the flight control tower glowed with the shifting light of multiple small fires, each one chewing at the damaged consoles that lined the walls. The air was drier here, the smoke thinner but hot enough to make every breath burn on the way down. The faint smell of scorched electronics cut through the haze, sharp and chemical, riding above the more familiar tang of burnt paint. Shards of glass littered the floor, glittering under the intermittent light from the flames. The tower windows were spiderwebbed from impacts, their fractured surfaces catching and scattering the red glare from outside. Through the broken gaps, Megan could see the flight deck below, still alive with moving shadows, arcs of silver spray, and the deep orange of open fire. Each glance through the glass was a reminder that the deck's chaos hadn't paused for their fight here. The enemy had taken positions behind the central console bank, their movements just visible through the rolling swirls of smoke. A burst of fire from their side sparked off the metal edge of a panel, sending fragments skittering across the floor. Megan dropped behind a burnt console, using its warped frame as cover. She didn't fire yet. Her focus stayed on the cluster of cables and relay boxes near the far wall. If the communications relay went down now, the carrier's air operations would be silent, no matter who held the tower. The Marines pushed in with disciplined bursts of movement, two advancing while the others provided cover. Each rush was tight and deliberate, designed to shave down the defender's space without damaging the equipment. Smoke curled along the ceiling, drifting lower with each passing second, until it hung just above head height. It twisted in the uneven airflow from the shattered windows, mixing firelight with the faint white of sprinkler spray drifting in from outside. One Marine vaulted a low partition, tackling an enemy who had tried to shift position. The brief scuffle ended with the man shoved to the deck, his weapon skidding away into the shadows under a console. Megan moved along the right flank, her boots crunching over broken glass. Every movement was measured, her eyes flicking between the firefight and the delicate tangle of wires near the relay. She kept her weapon ready, but her purpose here was to ensure that nothing, stray fire, shrapnel, or sabotage, touched the communications core. A second enemy tried to push toward the windows, maybe looking for an angle on the Marines below. Megan cut him off, her shot sparking against the bulkhead just above his cover. The distraction was enough for a corporal to close in from the opposite side, pulling him out into the open. The fight was ending, the defenders forced into smaller and smaller pockets of cover until there was nowhere left for them to move. When the last of them was secured, the room fell into a heavy silence broken only by the hiss of damaged equipment and the distant roar from the deck. Megan crossed to the relay, crouching to inspect it in the low light. The cables were intact, the control panel scorched, but still functional. She traced her gloved fingers over the connection ports, checking for heat damage or loose fittings. The core systems had survived the fight, and with them, the ship's ability to coordinate flight operations. She rose and stepped to the main console, switching to the headset hanging there. The voice from the bridge came through faint but clear, waiting for her confirmation. Megan's gaze swept the tower one last time, taking in the secured positions, the standing Marines, and the steady pulse of the relay lights in the corner. She pressed the transmit key, her voice even despite the strain in her lungs. Tower secure. Flight operations can resume. Outside, The spray from the sprinklers arced silver against the orange light of the burning deck. Through the fractured glass, Megan could see crews already shifting wreckage aside, the movements purposeful despite the heat and smoke. The vantage from the tower made it all visible. The chaos below, and the discipline that kept it from breaking apart. Control had been taken back, and now it had to be held. The fires would burn a while longer, but the ship's heart was beating steady again. The glass before her was fractured into a web of fine lines, each one catching light from the deck below and scattering it into faint glimmers. Megan stood with her hands on the scorched frame, the metal still warm from the fire that had clawed at it earlier. The tower was quieter now. The sharp reports of gunfire replaced by the hum of activity, a rhythm of work that felt steadier than the chaos they had fought through. Beyond the glass, the deck stretched out like a rough, smoke-hazed horizon, still shrouded in heat distortion that bent the shapes of men and machines into wavering silhouettes. Below, the damage control crews were already moving with deliberate efficiency. They worked in small teams, cutting away twisted pieces of wreckage, dragging charred debris toward the edges, and clearing paths wide enough for the next phase to begin. The sprinkler system was still active, sending down sheets of water that broke into fine mist in the rotor wash from the ship's surviving helicopters. Steam lifted from the deck in twisting plumes where water struck the hottest steel, curling upward into the thinning smoke. The smell of it was a mix of wet metal and burned paint, sharp enough to sting the back of her throat even from this height. Everywhere she looked, there was motion. A crew knelt in the shadow of a ruined aircraft, working to detach the last of its panels before the hulk was towed clear. Another team hauled a thick hose across the deck, their boots splashing through shallow pools that reflected the firelight still flickering along the port side. The carrier itself seemed to breathe under their weight, the subtle roll of the sea passing through its steel frame. It was the same ship they had fought to hold minutes ago, but it felt steadier now, anchored by the order of the work taking place. The smoke was not gone, but it had changed. Earlier, it had been a suffocating wall, a living thing that swallowed sound and sight in equal measure. Now it drifted in lighter bands, shifting with the wind and revealing more of the deck each time it cleared. The lights embedded along the edges began to reappear, faint at first, then brighter, until they seemed like a chain of distant stars suspended above the dark water. Each one was a fixed point in the haze, a marker of the deck's shape, returning after being hidden for so long. Megan shifted her weight and rested one shoulder lightly against the frame. The warmth of the metal was a reminder of how close the flames had come to consuming the tower entirely. She traced her gaze from the far end of the deck toward the island base. Following the paths the crews were cutting. The patterns were efficient, each team's movements overlapping just enough to keep the process constant. Even in fatigue, their posture was that of people who knew their work mattered more than their comfort. A sudden gust carried the sound of tools striking metal, the clank sharp in the thinning air. Voices followed, shouts of coordination, quick acknowledgments, and the dull roar of machinery coming back to life. Somewhere aft, the distinct whine of a hydraulic system wound up as equipment powered on. The ship was reassembling itself in plain view, not in grand gestures but in the steady layering of small, essential tasks. Heat distortion still shimmered across the deck, a restless ripple above the steel. It made the figures moving across it seem to float for an instant before snapping back into focus. Megan watched as a tractor unit rolled forward from the far side, pulling with it the first intact aircraft to be readied for launch. Its fuselage gleamed wet under the spray, droplets trailing along its sides before falling into the steam below. The movement drew the eyes of every crew member in its path, though none paused in their work. The tractor guided the aircraft into position at the forward launch area, aligning it with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. The The crew swarmed around it in practiced order, securing its hold and running quick checks even as the spray continued to fall. The scene was framed by the silver arcs of the sprinklers, their paths catching the glow of the deck lights and scattering it in bright fragments. The rest of the deck still carried scars, blackened patches of steel, warped panels, and scattered debris. But here was a single, undeniable sign that the carrier was still alive. From her vantage, Megan could see how the aircraft stood out against the darker background, the light and motion around it like a beacon. It was more than just a piece of machinery. It was a signal that the ship's purpose had not been broken by the fire or the fight. She took in the sight without speaking, letting the steady hum of the tower's equipment and the distant activity below settle into her awareness. Her headset came alive with a call from the bridge, the tone clear and direct. They were ready for the first launch sequence. Megan stepped away from the window, crossing to the main console where the communications gear sat lit and steady. She adjusted the headset until the mic sat close to her mouth, her eyes still tracking the deck through the fractured glass. Her voice, when she spoke, carried no hint of the fatigue or heat that still clung to her skin. "Clear to launch," she said, each word even and precise. The confirmation was met with a short acknowledgement, followed by the start of the sequence that would send the first aircraft off the deck since the battle had begun. She returned to the window, watching as the aircraft's engines spun up, the heat bloom around them warping the air in fresh waves. The crew stepped back in unison, signaling readiness. The catapult track ahead was clear, gleaming wet under the lights. And beyond it, the night sea stretched into shadow. The launch officer's hand came down, and in a surge of power and spray, the aircraft was hurled forward into the dark, its lights shrinking until they were just another point in the horizon's haze. Megan stood with her hands resting lightly against the frame, the warmth beneath her palms no longer from fire but from the steady heat of the systems running as they should. The deck was still marked by the battle, but the mission was moving forward. Continuity was not an afterthought. It was the deliberate choice made in every action below her. The smoke would linger for a while yet, but in the glow of the deck lights and the rhythm of work, the ship's defiance was clear.